So it is 7 o'clock. I just want to welcome everyone to this special presentation from the Collaborative Mentorship Network for Chronic Pain and Addiction program of the Alberta College of Family Physicians. We're delighted to have Dr. Vincent Lam joining us to present on Poppies, Words and Act. A physician and writer reflects upon the use of acceptance and commitment therapy in the treatment of opioid use disorder. I have a few housekeeping slides to start off with, but first I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. As you know, we would like to recognize that we're webcasting from and to many different parts of Alberta today. The province of Alberta is located on Treaty 6, Treaty 7, and Treaty 8 territory, and is the traditional meeting ground and home for many Indigenous peoples. And I'm Dr. Kathy Scrimshaw. I'm the medical director of the Collaborative Mentorship Network for Chronic Pain and Addiction. And these are my disclosures. I am a part-time paid employee of the Alberta College of Family Physicians, and I'm a rural family doctor from Pincher Creek. The program receives financial support through Health Canada's Substance Use and Addictions program in the form of a contribution, and it does not receive any in-kind support. And so for tonight's session, to capture your attendance, you need to click on the survey link in the chat log to enter your name and your email. We will be using the Q&A log to collect questions during the session, and there's an upvote feature. So the most popular questions are noted and answered first. You can use the chat log to comment, and also Dr. Lam will be asking for some participation, and we'd ask you to put that into the chat so that we can take a look at it. And we will be having an evaluation survey link posted in the chat near the end of the session. And it would be great if you guys can fill that out, because we really rely on your evaluations to develop our programming. So thank you very much. And with no further ado, I would love to introduce Dr. Vincent Lam, family physician, emergency physician, who is now working in addictions and also a very well-known writer. So thank you. And you're on mute.
There we are. Okay. Well, it's really great to be here. It's a tremendous pleasure. Thank you very much to Kathy Scrimshaw and Carrie McNabb, who invited me here to speak. And I just also wanted to tell you how excited I am that Dr. Marie Claire Burke is going to be delivering a session on ACT next Wednesday, the 19th of May. And that's entitled A Tough Act to Follow. I'm really grateful to all of you who are attending this workshop, and I've heard that it's a beautiful evening in Edmonton, and I hope in all of Alberta. So thank you for spending a little time here with me. It's kind of a new thing for me actually to do this sort of presentation via Zoom. And I feel it's a little bit like radio. You know, normally when I present, for better or for worse, there's all kinds of people in the room. And now I'm just imagining all of you. But imagination can be a powerful thing, and hopefully we'll be able to, through the particularity of this medium, discuss this topic. And it's actually a really personal topic to me. It's a professional topic, but it's a really personal topic as well. And so I'm hoping this format lends itself to a sense of intimacy in that way. So it really is a great privilege to have a chance to share several things that I'm passionate about. I'm a physician and I'm a novelist, and I work in addictions medicine now. I previously worked in emergency medicine. And so much of my work is caring for people who deal with opioid use disorder in their lives. And my particular interest within that realm of work is the use of acceptance and commitment therapy in addictions medicine. It's also commonly called ACT. And so you're going to get a little bit of Poppies, words, and act in this talk. So does anyone know what this animal is? I'm going to assume that some people know that this is a platypus. And so this has the bill of a duck, the tail of a beaver, and the feet of an otter. This is an Eastern Australian egg-laying mammal. When it was first examined in 1799 in Europe, they thought it was probably that someone had sewed together a whole bunch of different animals because it was so improbable. And so the talk I'm going to give you is a little bit like the platypus. It may seem at first like a whole bunch of different things that are sewn together, but I'm going to try to sew them together to convince you of my central thesis, which is that improbably, but I hope that you will be compelled, the crucial elements of the novel are also the crucial elements of applying ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, to addictions treatment. So before I go any further, I will tell you that there's a body of literature supporting the use of ACT in addictions. It's a small and, to me, very compelling body of literature. And certainly you can email me if you would like me to send you some references. But right now, you're just going to have to take my word that some evidence exists and more evidence is needed. This is what novelists can get away with. We can just say things like that. No graphs or anything in this talk. And of course, there's no evidence whatsoever equating novels with any practice of any type of medicine. But still, I'm going to try to share with you what feel like some of the similarities to me. Now, what I don't want you to conclude from this talk is that you need to be a novelist to do ACT. That would be far too much trouble. So you heard it here first, you do not need to be a novelist to do acceptance and commitment therapy. And in fact, I hope through this talk to stimulate in you some thinking about how ACT might apply in some way to your practice, whether that is an addictions practice, a pain practice, or a general family medicine practice. Your practice might be different from mine, but I'm hoping that you will still hear something that resonates. Very importantly, if there's any good thing that can come out of this talk, it may be that it saves you the trouble of becoming a novelist. I can guarantee you it's a huge hassle to become a novelist. So we should begin with a few concepts. First, a quick review. I'm sure you are familiar with the DSM-5 criteria for opioid use disorders and for substance use disorders, which we can refer broadly as addictions. The DSM-5 observed that addictions involve two elements: physiological change, which manifests as withdrawal and tolerance, and behavioral change, which means that for the sake of using a substance, a person behaves in a way that negatively affects their life. Once again, I will spare you an actual DSM-5 slide because I think everyone is sick of seeing DSM-5 criteria on a slide. However, I do have a slide about ACT. And I promise you this is the busiest slide in the whole talk, but it is important for me to share this with you because this is a great graphic. It's well known in the ACT community. It's called the ACT hexaflex, and it visually represents the notion that ACT has 6 interlinked skills, and these interlinked skills are skills that we try to practice as practitioners of ACT, and in so doing, we hope also to cultivate these skills implicitly as well as explicitly in our patients. So the ACT hexaflex gives us a sense of these 6 skills and how they're linked together. ACT is a mindfulness-based behavioral therapy, which helps us to have more flexible relationships with our own internal experiences, and which encourages committed actions that move us towards our own deeply valued concepts of self. And so you will notice that I'm using the first person plural and referring to us. Now, that's a tense which is rarely used in novels because we can't really write that often. Sometimes we do, but we can't really write that often about things that happen to us. But this is something that we do want to think about when we're doing ACT, because even though we are concerned with patient care, ACT relies upon the notion of shared human experience and the concept that we all have a great deal in common with our patients. So we're not kind of up in our ivory tower telling patients what's best for them. We're on the ground, we're walking alongside them. We just happen to be able to have the ability to look over and, see their gait, see how they're walking in a way that's easier for us to see sometimes than they can. ACT is based on a cognitive linguistic theory known as relational frame theory. And so it is based on the power of words. Just like novels, ACT recognizes that words are a crucial tool and potentially a great burden for human beings. So this is the ACT hexaflex, this visual representation. In much of medicine, we take the view that something in the mind and body of the patient is broken, and our job is to fix it. But ACT has a slightly different view. ACT takes the view that many problematic behaviors simply come out of people engaging in normal processes, but getting stuck in these normal processes, and sometimes getting stuck to extremes. No one likes pain. We're all programmed, evolved to avoid pain. But we all know that painkillers used in excess and rigidly without flexibility can cause a great deal of problems. And so in trying to address that stuckness, ACT tries to cultivate a flexibility in the form of new skills. So let's do a quick tour through the ACT hexaflex, just so that you get a sense of what we're talking about. And we're going to start in the bottom left sort of corner where it says diffusion. Watch your thinking. So fusion is the normal process of getting all caught up in strong feelings and powerful thoughts. I'm pretty sure that all of us have experienced that over the course of this past difficult year. We've had moments when we thought, what am I going to do? We've had moments where we thought, oh my God. And we could very easily, just like everyone around us, get caught up in these thoughts. But we couldn't remain there. We couldn't just stick in there. We had to do what we needed to do as physicians and as community members to help address the pandemic. Another example, let's each think of the last time we had a disagreement with a spouse or a partner. Were we easily caught up in strong thoughts and feelings? Whenever he says that, whenever she does this, etc., right? So of course, we all have the experience of being caught up in strong thoughts and feelings. This is about all of us. And so in response, diffusion is the ACT skill of watching and observing our own thoughts and emotions, not dismissing them, but developing the capacity to observe them. So let's move up. So we're going to make a clockwise tour. So we're going to go to where it says acceptance. And acceptance is the skill that we want to cultivate, because what we know is that it's very normal to default to experiential avoidance, the process of avoiding unpleasant internal experience. This is our natural response to pain, hence we take painkillers. Now, we might also know that it will be stressful to have a difficult conversation with a patient. And so perhaps we avoid the conversation and therefore avoid the feeling of stress. Some people seek to avoid the unknown, avoid fears that they perhaps can barely articulate, fears of powerful institutions, fears of new medical interventions, and so they decide to avoid a vaccine. Well, the outcome is very problematic. The process is actually normal. So in response, acceptance or willingness is the ACT skill of making room for the experience of stress in order to have that conversation which is important for the patient, perhaps in order to accept an intervention such as a new vaccination, while acknowledging that it's acceptable to feel anxious. It's totally normal to have apprehensions about the unknown. Now we move up to the top of the hexaflex where it says, be here now, contact with the present moment. Now, I think in the past year, all of us have watched more Netflix than we have probably in the previous 5 years combined. Maybe not this month, because now we're all running around madly trying to vaccinate as many people as possible. But prior to this month, I think it was a really, really common and normal thing to seek out strategies of experiential avoidance. The past year has been tough. And so, naturally, we have sought escape. And some of that can be innocent. A little bit of Netflix, a couple of episodes of a favorite show. Some of that has been deadly. And we've seen that the escape in the use of extremely dangerous substances has led to a spike in overdose deaths across the country. And so the skill which ACT seeks to cultivate is the skill of being here now, contacting the present moment, existing and living in the present moment. To be clear, ACT doesn't tell us that experiential avoidance is wrong and we must never avoid experience. ACT asks us to be flexible. Watching one episode of a favorite show on Netflix, probably okay. Binge watching an entire season while I have a clinic scheduled, probably rigid and unworkable behavior in the long run. The process of distance from the present moment also shows up as our normal tendency to feel depressed about the past and anxious about the future. We really feel badly about mistakes we've made before, whether those are personal mistakes or mistakes with patients, perhaps. And we feel anxious about the future. We wonder, how effective is a single shot going to be while we delay for the second shot? How effective is it going to be if we end up needing combination vaccines? It's normal to be anxious about that. So I could be depressed about the past, thinking, gosh, last time I gave a workshop like this, I made a few mistakes, and I could be anxious about the future. Gosh, what if I mess up this talk? I'm sure I will make some mistakes. And this is all normal because my mind is helping me to learn from mistakes and to prepare for problems that might arise. However, if I'm too caught up in the past, too caught up in the present, then I can't be here right now, giving this talk in a mindful and attentive way. So the relevant ACT skill is contacting the present moment, which is what it sounds like. It's about being in the present moment. So distance from values is when I don't really know why I'm doing something. And we've all done this, right? We've all done something because we thought we should, because our parents said we should, our spouse was nagging us, we did it, right? Maybe it was a very socially acceptable, non-controversial thing to do, but maybe we still did it and didn't really know why we did that. Distance from values often drives reflexive behavior and sometimes can even allow us to do difficult things because we just do it. But have you ever felt that difference when you really believe in something you're doing, say in your practice, that difference of having a sense of investment, a sense of reason for doing it? Those are values. Those are the things that guide our compass, that guide our ship in a dark sea. Reactive actions are when, we're just kind of drifting through life, doing stuff, going through the motions because that's what I like. And now we're at the bottom right corner of the hexaflex. In contrast, the ACT skill of committed action is about making sure, or at least trying my best, to think and feel that the things that I do and the way I do them line up with the kind of person that I want to be. And finally, at the bottom of the hexaflex, the normal process is that we all experience ourselves instinctively as self as content. My life is what it is. My life is what I'm experiencing right now. And of course, there's a certain sense in which that's absolutely true. And we certainly cultivate the skill of contact with the present moment because it's important to be right here, right now. There's also another ACT skill, which is about flexibility of perspective, being able to notice the thoughts that occur to me, being able to notice my responses to the world, being able to notice my ability to notice. And hopefully this gives me more flexibility and allows me then to choose to behave like the person that I want to be. So that's all fine. You're thinking, that sounds good. But, what's this stuff about a novelist and a novelist's perspective on ACT and addictions? Well, we're going to go back to your high school English literature classes, and we're going to talk a bit about the key elements of novels. Novels have 3 essential elements: plot, character, and point of view. And so I'm going to give you a couple of clinical cases to make some important points. I've changed the details for confidentiality, and these are 2 patients of mine. First, we're going to talk a little bit about plot. Case A, 27-year-old man, diagnosis of opioid use disorder, ongoing methadone treatment, attends a 7-year-old, his child's birthday party. She and another child go into a bathroom together. They come out there giggling. Patient A concludes that they have been exploring each other's genitalia. And he tells me, his physician, his daughter denied this. And he tells me that he fears that both this happened between the children, and that the reason his daughter allowed this to happen is because she is currently somehow being sexually abused by an adult in her life. And so as he tells me this, he's weeping and relating his own childhood sexual abuse. So I'm going to ask you, what thoughts show up for you? What reactions? And you can enter them in the chat box. And I'm going to hope to find the chat box. I might need help on finding the chat box.
I'll read out some as they come, and I think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so transference,
Right.
was one thing that has come up. I'm still waiting. Projection.
Right. Yeah, I think those are absolutely front of mind for me, and yeah. I'm thinking about the patient having those things, and I know that at the moment that this happened in my clinic, I was also experiencing lots of emotions towards the patient, lots of really strong feelings of empathy, feelings of discomfort in terms of my own competence, and what am I going to offer to this person who's had this terrible thing happen, and who's now kind of projecting and transferring in terms of their interpretation of their own child.
Yeah, and some more stuff is coming back up. Here's flashback, triggered associations, understandable anxiety given his own experience, unresolved sexual abuse, and then sad and fear, an anger of stigma, assuming the methadone user is an abuser, discomfort, and wanting to protect as he never was protected as a child, finding strength in that fear. And
yeah, absolutely. The echoes of trauma,
yeah, all through.
Reverberates, and ripples through everything. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, very much for those reactions. Much the same for me. Okay. Let me share with you another case, and thank you, because what we're doing is we're trying to notice our own thoughts here, as well as our understanding of the case. So case B. So this is another patient of mine, also diagnosis of opioid use disorder, ongoing methadone treatment. And this person has relapsed to heavy cocaine use for a week, also has started dealing in order to be able to afford large quantities of cocaine. Several fights this week, disruptive shouting match today in the waiting room. aggressive, angry, just give me my script, doc. I gotta go. The police are looking for me. There's more colorful language here, but I haven't put it in the slide um, for the sake of an all ages audience. So now, you've got this angry, yelling guy. So what thoughts show up for people now? What are people's reactions now to this case? We're focusing on the noticing part. We're trying to cultivate that ability to notice. Okay, so these are my reactions. These are my thoughts about the case, and both my thoughts as I'm reacting to the case.
So we have frustration, empathy, and sadness all at the same time, overwhelmed, driven by fear, desperation, and then feeling threatened.
Yeah. Yeah, it's scary sometimes,
Yeah, and scared came up, past trauma, disappointment, angry, and then, reflecting back, must be very afraid, annoyance, worry, scared came up again.
Absolutely. So some of the same reflections. So there's, both the trauma piece, the awareness of something going on with the patient, and then the experience of being traumatized by an aggressive interaction. Yeah, and for me, certainly, part of it is also, I know that my experiential avoidance kicks right in, and it's a normal, and this is a great example of an absolutely normal evolutionary mechanism: avoid danger, right? So aggressive, angry, intoxicated patient, my self-preservation says, avoid this situation, end it as quickly as possible. Normal reaction, right? So we can observe that, or I can observe that in myself as well.
Yeah, avoidance did come up, and then came up with, why didn't I become a dentist? The thought.
That's maybe a large existential question. Although I think the dentists had a hard time over the past year. So
yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a confession. I left out a key element of both cases, which is that these are not two separate patients. These are the same patient, 1 week apart. So I did that for a reason. I did that because plot allows us to think of events in a different way. And this patient, who in case B had just gone to attend his child's birthday party, was sobbing, weeping, really vulnerable, really triggered and reliving past trauma, everything that you all pointed to so astutely and empathically, kicked into overdrive in terms of experiential avoidance, and did the sprint away from all of his own emotions, which was the heavy relapse, and with that, the consequences that result in his presentation as case B. And so we also end up thinking of the patient differently. We probably have our own reactions, which are much the same in each clinical encounter, but knowing that it's the same person, knowing that the person in case A is the person in case B, which of course I had the advantage of knowing because I saw the patient both times, how do we then think differently about it? And I just invite your thoughts in the chat. I know for myself, it becomes mixed. It becomes messy, right? There's all of those things are there. I feel threatened. I feel empathic. I feel very sad in a sense of the human commonality of sadness, and I feel frustration. And what I'm not trying to do is say that any of these are right or wrong, but it's useful to be able to notice them all, and to be able to notice that these are all part of our own internal experience.
And some of the things that are coming up in the chat is compassion is easier with the context. And curious, what has led to this change in behavior. We're more understanding when we know the background. And then suspending judgment, observing the feelings, maintaining curiosity regarding drivers of the emotion and the behaviors, not the person. Not shocked or surprised when trauma's opened up with no additional supports in place. The patient will turn to what they know best, which is using.
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. And I'm so glad that someone mentioned curiosity, because curiosity is one of these absolute key pieces of ACT. And so in ACT, we're often talking about noticing, about observing. And of course, what is it that we wish to be the driver of noticing and observing? Well, we wish it to be curiosity. We want to be interested. We want to be engaged, to think about, okay, so what's going on there? What is that? So watching for plot affects our understanding of the patient in front of us. The linkage of disparate encounters and scenes creates and alters meaning. In medicine, we sometimes make the error of thinking that the start of the problem is the moment that someone walks through our door. In fact, when it comes to addictions medicine, the addiction usually comes midway through the story. So if we only see one episode and one behavior, we may think, and we may be correct, that this person has PTSD or ASPD, but thinking through the lens of plot is to think through the lens of process. Patient AB suffered trauma from a young age and carries the imprint of his own abuse. And so when triggered in a particular way, he uses experiential avoidance to escape feelings of loneliness, vulnerability, and shame with drug use, belligerent behavior, and violence. Over time, we worked on grounding, diffusion, willingness. He was able to stabilize, which is not to say that he changed completely. And the pattern of behavior continues to be something that we work on together and work on processes when he's able to. ACT is about making room for difficult feelings, and committed action is about what actions move you in the direction you want your life to go. So let's talk for a bit about character. So we all have favorite characters from books. Something about certain characters draws us in. What is it? It's usually something about their way of seeing the world, which might line up with our own, or that of some imaginary self, some way that we imagine ourselves as we could be. So what can ACT offer us here? ACT is based conceptually on relational frame theory, which suggests that our human minds build systems of relations in order to make sense of the world and to cope with it. And this can be useful in all of our lives. So we learn that the red flashing hand at the intersection means do not walk. You could get killed by a car. This is totally arbitrary. We could have decided that the red hand means come here, and then we would do something different and not get killed. Like this stop sign, words, specific actions, all kinds of symbols within these systems can be arbitrary and yet remain powerful for the rest of our lives. Relational frame theory is a theory about a way of seeing the world, and so it explains why your favorite character in a novel is your favorite character. Our childhood experiences may forever determine whether outstretched arms mean that we are about to be hugged with warmth and care, or seized and shaken violently. Whether someone calling our name means they want to engage with curiosity and interest, or whether that immediately means they are likely to scold us and criticize us. The enduring generalization of symbols means that when AB's daughter enters the bathroom with another child and emerges giggling, an entire network of painful memories and meanings related to his own trauma is triggered. And so in ACT terms, AB is fused, cognitively fused with a specific interpretation. In the following week, he becomes very distant from the present moment, depressed, anxious, which brings us to his relapse in cocaine use and violence. Where then does relational frame theory fit generally into the treatment of addictions? For many people, the use of substances is initially motivated by a desire to avoid forms of internal distress, such as pain, anxiety, and boredom. I think we've all heard patients whom, when we ask them, well, why did you use? They say, well, I was just bored. Now, that may not be the entire story, but in fact, boredom is extremely distressing. And as with other forms of distress, the use of substances can be used as an escape. The simple truth is that opioids feel really good. When I ask my patients what they feel like, they say they feel like a warm hug. It feels like everything is going to be okay. People have told me opioids feel like love. And so we call this euphoria or being high. But imagine the meaning of feeling love to someone who rarely experiences love and doesn't believe they're worthy of it. Of course, the warm hug becomes a strangling chokehold when withdrawal symptoms develop. And meanwhile, the network of relations, the mental link between the action of using and the result of feeling wonderful, becomes so strong that people continue with the same actions, even when the wonderful feeling is long gone. For opioids, as well as other substances such as alcohol and benzodiazepines, soon enough, their only relief from withdrawal symptoms is the substance which has them stuck. And so in relational frame theory terms, the cycle of withdrawal and its relief creates its own strong bond. All of us in addictions medicine have patients whose withdrawal is controlled by medications like methadone or buprenorphine, and who report that opioids no longer have any effect upon them, but who continue to use nonetheless. Why? Well, just like you hopefully automatically stop walking when you see the red hand, even if there's no car in sight, the symbolic power of swallowing a pill or injecting or snorting a line can remain intact. If we learn to associate substance use with comfort or an escape from distress, that symbolic power can remain even when the substances are destroying our lives. If we talk about character, we should also talk about our concepts of character. One way to think of characters in a novel is as representations of emotions, judgments, and values. They're foisted upon the protagonists by writers and readers. These poor characters in novels, we assign to them whatever we think they should feel. And in parallel, as clinicians, we constantly attempt to squeeze our patients into conceptual boxes that we have built. That's the exercise of the DSM. We use our own relational frames to make our patients into the types of characters whom we know. And we know them because we read about them in the DSM. And so our understanding of the character of substance-dependent patients speaks to our entire concept of the etiology of substance use disorder. So one view of what kind of character we're talking about here would be the cowboy Western etiology of addiction. And so this might be apropos in Alberta. I'm not sure if either of these people are your patients, but this concept is embodied in Nancy Reagan's Just Say No slogan, where the concept is that the use of substances is purely a choice. There's a moral dimension, choices are right or wrong, that's the narrative. And this is implicit in statements that we sometimes make, such as, quote, they have to want to change, implying that without some spark of the correct moral choice, all other efforts are futile. If one were a novelist writing this character, it would suit this image. This is the villain. He's got a black mask He's made the wrong choice. We actually have no idea why the guy in the mask and the black hat robbed the train and shot at the conductor, but it doesn't matter. He's the bad guy.
Alternately, in some accounts of the media, in which pharmaceutical manufacturers and doctors are the culprits, as, quote, the evil prescribers of opioids, patients are simply the victims. The patient is the stagecoach conductor. I think that both of these views are incomplete at the level of the individual patient, who is neither purely a victim or a villain, but a human being who got to wherever they are right now by doing things that are likely based in normal human processes. What's another way to think about the type of character that we're grappling with in addictions medicine? So we can also think about, in book terms, the Frankenstein etiology of addiction. And this is what we talk about when we discuss genetic predisposition. And so Mary Shelley wrote a novel about a being that was always destined to be a monster. And here the notion is that some of us are just pre-wired with vulnerabilities that were predisposed to the problematic use of substances. And in the biomedical model of much of medicine, that view has prevailed for most of the last century. That view is one where we're all kind of flesh and blood machines. We left the factory with some kind of defect, and doctors are like an auto repairman trying to cobble together some kind of solution and fix the machine. I also find this view incomplete because we all know that patients can change. And hopefully we are humble enough to know that the biggest changes in their lives are through their actions and not ours. I'm not dismissing any of these viewpoints, but just pointing out where I find them incomplete. For me, the most interesting view of substance use disorders is the learning model, or that of neuroplasticity. We become better and better at doing what we do repeatedly, whether that's assessing patients, solving the Rubik's Cube, which I can't do, even though my daughter keeps on trying to teach me to do it, or avoiding distress, finding comfort through other opioids. The neuroplasticity view is also most compatible with our growing understanding of trauma, wherein the use of substances correlates with, and for many seems to be a response to trauma. ACT understands that the normal psychological processes of a normal human being can be very destructive and can cause suffering, especially when they wire themselves into our brains in a rigid way. There's no delete button on these experiences. And it's worth noting that this expectation, this delete button expectation, is implicit in many common, well-meaning phrases used by both lay people and clinicians. When we say, just think positive, move on with life, leave it behind, forget about it. What we're saying is, just delete that thing that you're thinking about. Just delete that memory. However, there is no way to erase the existing relations in relational frame theory. And the goal of ACT is not to do so. The goal is to create enough flexibility and perspective that we can add new layers of relations, new responses in order to move towards new behaviors. In the novel, character consists of the protagonist's understanding of the world. And meanwhile, the premise and the pleasure of most serious literature is that characters evolve, transform, and grow in the course of the book. The hopeful proposition of both the neuroplasticity model and ACT is that a brain plastic enough to learn its way through addiction cannot unlearn what it has learned, but can learn beyond it. Opiate substitution therapy in the form of methadone or buprenorphine is the most successful pharmacological treatment for opiate use disorder. And people will sometimes say, quote, it's just another drug. But one of the very important things that substitution therapy achieves is that it creates a new relational model. Short-acting opioids work in a way that respond to patients' experience of the moment. In contrast, opioid substitution therapy is not rapidly responsive to people's acute internal experiences. Instead, it provides a stable base upon which people can stand while they do other things in their lives. And so we can think of this difference in their mode of action as creating a new relational frame. Characters in novels usually start with problems, and that's what makes it interesting. In having problems, they are fused with all kinds of beliefs about themselves and the world. Meanwhile, they and we are unsure where they're going to go in the book. They may be distant from their values. In optimistic novels, usually what happens is that characters figure out what really matters to them and they go after it. There usually isn't a chapter that says the character is now defusing from past rigid beliefs, but we know that as readers, we love it when our favorite character figures out the mistake they are making and does something that is more true to themselves. In other words, they are unhooking from their initial difficult thoughts and connecting with what is really valuable to them. We love that as readers, just like we love that when our patients do it. And so a question I have begun to ask of my patients is, does the fish know that it swims in water? This is a central paradox within ACT. ACT asks us to inhabit a grounded, intense, first-person perspective by being aware of and present within the moment in which we exist right now, here in our physical senses and our observations of our present consciousness. Simultaneously, it asks us to inhabit a third-person perspective, observant of our thoughts, identifying our emotions, attaching words to the forces that bubble up hot like lava so that we can cool them a little bit in the distance of a third-person observation. So ACT is asking us both to be the fish, which knows it swims in water. This is actually similar to our enjoyment of the novel. When I read a novel, I remain me, the reader, but I also inhabit the life of the character, and much of the pleasure is shifting between one life and the other. Point of view, case C. This is 29-year-old patient, not the same patient 2 years later, but this is a patient diagnosis of opiate use disorder, ongoing methadone, assaulted jaw fracture, surgical fixation, discharged with tons of opioids, non-unit fracture, not following up, not receiving definitive surgical care. Dramatic fantasy of getting so sick that they're going to have to rush me to the OR. So in the novel, what allows the reader to focus on what matters is being engaged with the character, the self as content. The normal force of self as content is analogous to the second person voice. One feels as if one is being given commands that cannot be ignored, such as, you must have ongoing hydromorphone. You need the doctors to swoop in and rescue you. A writer will tell you that the second person voice used in a novel is almost impossible to write because it would be awkward and rigid, and so it is not used. We use first and we use third person. Yet somehow we all live with our own version of the second person voice. This is the voice which speaks to us perhaps from childhood or from our own past, saying, people are going to see right through you. You're not good enough. You don't really know what you're doing. We all hear our own second person voice, and we have all responded to its commands in our own way. Maybe some of us decided to become doctors. Maybe some of us grappled with a substance use disorder. Many people who have a substance use disorder have simply heard that voice say, you feel bad. You need to do something about it. The pill will fix the problem. And so part of the key to understanding the way the second person voice works in literature is to know that there's always an implicit first person. No matter how authoritative the commands are, which may be given in the second person, there is always a speaker, the one who makes the judgment, the one who lays the blame, the one who says, This is pain. This is shame. And also, there is always a listener, the third person. And when we help our patients with the ACT skill of self as context, we are helping them to connect with their own first person, the one who experiences the world as it is around them, and their own third person, the one who is able to watch, the one who is able to notice, the one who is able to observe. And the hope is that their second person voice can therefore speak a little bit more quietly. So, novels are this series of words on paper, relational sets, which coalesce as thoughts, feelings, and ideas. Meanwhile, both we and our patients live the novels of our lives. Yes, we address the material circumstances of the present, but much of what we believe about our own deep nature has been written in words that our minds read to us, which were formed as part of our natural mental processes, but which can nonetheless cause deep suffering. These can imprison us just as tightly as our dopamine receptors. In treating addictions using acceptance and commitment therapy, what we wish to help people find is their own words and their own voices, which will hopefully allow them to write the remainder of their own novels. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a lovely reflection and an understanding of acceptance and commitment therapy. And so if people have questions, if you can put it in the Q&A, we do have a great question here from Darlene Marchuk. She works in residential addiction treatment where the client is supported 24/7. We are trauma responsive and do trauma work in a safe environment. It baffles me why some therapists and community open trauma in a person's early recovery journey when they see a client for 1 hour of 168. What is the client to do for the 167 hours they're not in therapy when trauma is opened up and the individual has no supports in place? The question is for you is, when you do trauma work with a patient, such as the case example you shared, what supports do you ensure are in place?
Yeah, so I think that's an extremely important comment. And, you know, I work from the presumption, and happily I'm sometimes proven to be incorrect, but I work from the presumption that every patient in front of me has experienced some form of significant trauma. And as I said, you know, sometimes over the course of time, I learned that that's not quite true in the way I imagined it might have been, but in a huge proportion of patients that I see, it is in fact a huge factor. You know, I think part of what underlies that question is the notion of when and how is the right time to engage in trauma work, right? And by that, I think you mean like a very explicit kind of engagement with the trauma in, you know, in a named way in therapy. And for me, I have the great luxury of seeing people often because I do pharmacotherapy with patients over often a long period of time. And so I never ask about trauma in an explicit way during initial assessments. I know it's incredibly important, but I know that if we build a relationship of trust, then slowly there's every likelihood that if the patient wants it to be part of our discussion and senses that there's a trusting relationship, it will become part of our discussion. I think that when we think about what we're doing, however, we can really use a trauma-informed lens to think about the meaning of what's happening in front of me, right? So, so we used the example of a patient who is angry, right? And I have a lot of angry patients. I think anyone who works in addictions or pain or maybe in medicine these days, it's a very difficult moment in medicine right now, has their fair share of angry patients, and just to use that example, if we think about where anger comes from, anger is usually a secondary emotion. And usually it comes as an emotional escape strategy, which allows someone to escape a more painful emotion. So allows people to escape a feeling of helplessness, a feeling of vulnerability, maybe a feeling of inadequacy, not being good enough. And so the anger really feels much more powerful than those other things, which feel so powerless. Right. And if we're aware of that and kind of, sensitive to that, then it changes the way that that we both understand, but also deal with that situation. Right. And I think most people who are angry expect one of two responses. For instance, most people who are angry expect the person whom they're interacting with to either also become angry, right? And that will sort of inflate the situation in a certain way. Or expect the person in front of them to kind of back down, to be submissive to their aggression. And both of those responses, can be problematic in terms of the therapeutic relationship. So if we understand what's going on and we can choose a very middle place where we neither escalate the situation nor submit to the aggression, then that can start to challenge people's understanding of how these sorts of situations play out, by changing the patterning that they've experienced in the past. So, I mean, in the day-to-day, I guess what I'm saying, just using one small example, is that I think in the day-to-day management of pharmacotherapy and situations, we can very, very much be informed by our understanding of the dynamics of trauma without ever having to name trauma, right? So that's kind of in sort of the day-to-day care and pharmacotherapy and sorting out people. I think we can fold a lot of behavioral work into it. And then the other thing, which is important, so I also do dedicated acceptance and commitment therapy, where we actually say, what, we're not going to talk about your pharmacotherapy. We're just going to put aside this time for ACT work. And, I always tell people that it actually doesn't really matter actually, I wouldn't say it doesn't really matter, but it's not completely necessary for them to discuss the specifics of their trauma in order for us to work on what it has done to their lives. And so I tell people, if they want to discuss the specifics of something that happened to them, they can. But they can also just feel free to tell me, something happened and, I'd rather talk about what happened next. And I find that for a lot of people, there's a big sigh of relief. It's a very careful kind of way to phrase it, to not invalidate what has happened to people and to convey a sense that, I'm really totally available to you if you do want to share the specifics of what happened. But, right, also gives people the option of doing trauma work without actually going through specific events before they're ready, or in some cases ever.
That's great. I have a classmate of yours that is asking a question. Christine Gibson. She says, hi, Vincent. Also, U of T 99.
Yeah. Same class. Hi, Christine.
She's doing trauma therapy with refugees at the addiction clinic. What are your thoughts on top-down and bottom-up therapies? Also, are you familiar with ART, which in my experience does change the relational frame dramatically?
Well, I mean, this is great because I can learn a lot here, because I'm actually not familiar with top down versus bottom up therapy, and I can't say that I'm trained in art therapy or have practiced it, but I would love to know. I don't know if that's possible on this platform. What Christine's observations are.
maybe that's like a big ask of the chat
Carrie,
box.
can you unmute Chris or Christine?
Absolutely. Just give me 1 second here.
Yeah, and we can go on to the next question while she gets prepared there. As a
Awesome.
family physician who has a particularly challenging patient with chronic pain who is only interested in medication approach and who is reluctant to engage in any other models for chronic pain management, like seeing our PCN or like our primary care network therapist, et cetera, is there any approach from ACT that might help me engage with him?
Yeah, so I think the starting point is, for me, a longitudinal relationship, right? And then being alert for moments that that the solution that the patient imagines will be sort of omnipotent, the molecules will fix it all. To be alert for moments when that isn't working out, and then to be able to explore what's going on and what the experience is like, right? So, so for instance, I think the experience of opioid withdrawal is something that people go through either because they're unstable, right? And for instance, they may be on an opioid agonist therapy, but they're also using short-acting opioids concurrently, and so they end up experiencing withdrawal. Or people experience opioid withdrawal when they choose to taper their OAT. And so, in withdrawal, people feel a whole range of emotions, and and those include anxiety, sadness, a sense of helplessness. There can be a lot of distress that's associated with that, right? So, for instance, in the scenario of someone who is tapering voluntarily because they wish to taper off their OAT, right? That's a real opportunity, right? To say, okay, well, I get it that you want to taper, right? And I respect your wish. I wonder if we should be talking also about the values that inform that decision, right? And in ACT terms, we talk about values as, the shorthand for it is the way you want to treat yourself and the way you want to treat others. And so we can ask, okay, so in choosing to taper your medication, what are the values that underlie this? So what is the aspect of how you want to treat yourself that informs that decision? And then pair that with a discussion of acceptance, right? Where acceptance is framed in terms of the unpleasant experience of withdrawal, right? And then you can link the two and say, okay, well, you've decided that you want to taper, and it's really good that you understand your values around that. Can we work on some of the skills associated with accepting the negative experience and the work that comes with that in tapering, if we can link that to that being in service of your values, right? So that's one way you can sort of link that in that scenario. In the other scenario, where it's someone who's having a lot of unpleasant experiences, they're on OAT or not, but they're experiencing a lot of withdrawal because they're unstable and they're really, and their life is just really chaotic. I mean, that's a place where, you can often talk with people about the dimension of experiential avoidance, right? And the way in which, and often this is really something that you can do with a diagram on paper, and that really helps people. You can say, okay, well, this is totally normal. Absolutely, you feel terrible, you feel sick, so of course you want to get better. So of course you're using 3 points of fentanyl a day, but now what happens, right? And then they can quite easily see, oh, okay, so right, I'm doing this thing which is totally normal. I'm avoiding the experience of withdrawal. I'm using fentanyl, and that takes me away. But then what happens next? Oh, my withdrawal gets worse, right? And so you draw this kind of as this looped circle and show it to people and say, okay, so what you know, where's the exit point here? I mean, is there a way out if one thing leads to, you know, brief relief and then back in this circle? You know, so that's a way in where you can start to engage people in understanding the dynamics of experiential avoidance, you know, and then also understanding the dynamics of some experiential acceptance, and hopefully some committed action, you know, is where you can go from there in terms of changing that particular cycle. So I know I'm using very long answers to these questions, um, but you know, I do think there's a ton of opportunities in the day-to-day care where if you're flexible with your toolkit, you can get right in there in the day-to-day experience of people's lives.
That's great. I don't know, Christine, do you want to elaborate on your question?
I could. I feel bad though, because there's some really great questions in the chat. Hey, Vince.
Hey.
Yeah, it's so funny how our careers are taking these interesting turns. So top-down therapy is cognitive and bottom-up is somatic. And I find with people who have embedded trauma, a lot of times I have to start with the bottom-up and do a lot of work with the body without engaging their cognitive brain because the amygdalas are firing so often. And then eventually I can get to something like ACT because they're just not ready at first. So I just was wondering on your approach as to when you feel like they're cognitively ready. And then ART is accelerated resolution therapy. It's kind of like next gen EMDR. And I find that it can totally shift what's stored in the amygdalas.
Oh, wow. Okay. I will definitely have to inform myself and educate myself about ART. And I'm glad that you brought up that concept of top down versus bottom up. And you know, I've actually committed the worst sin in all of ACT therapy and ACT presenting during this talk, because I've spent the entire time talking about ACT rather than doing ACT. You know, and of course, as I say that, you know, my own judging thoughts about my suitability as an ACT presenter come and hook me, and I have to defuse them so that I can continue to talk to you. But this talk has been very much, you know, top down. This has been very much like the concepts, and this is how it all fits together. And I'm really glad that you asked the question because actually very much, you know, the first thing that I'll do typically with people is grounding. And grounding is very much, you know, I think from the framing that if I understand your framing correctly, you know, it's very much bottom up, right? And so the typical scenario, and again, this is like an everyday clinical scenario, is that someone is in great distress because of something, you know, and it doesn't really matter what the issue is, you know, partner left, dog died, you know, phone got run over by a dump truck, all of these things, you know, immense distress. And so usually the first time I get to do a skill is very much the bottom up skill of grounding. And then I do it, there's a few things I do in very specific ways when I do grounding. So I always do it eyes open. A lot of times people will have done some kind of grounding exercise, or I'll ask people, what have you done before? What kind of skills have you done before? And they'll say, well, breathing, right? And, you know, I'll explore and just try to suss out what the breathing was about. And it becomes clear to me, you know, that the way it was employed, and there's nothing particularly wrong about this, but the way that it was employed was in essence as an experiential avoidance exercise. You know, breathe really slowly, breathe really deeply, kind of to give yourself a break from the things that are really bothering you. You know, or close your eyes, you know, and just be calm. And again, you know, get away from the things that are really bothering you and kind of do a bit of an escape. I'm not saying that these are not useful things to do, but because sometimes they are. But from an ACT point of view, the way grounding is intended to function is it's intended to situate the person physically, viscerally, somatically in the moment with their present experience. You know, so I specifically have people do it eyes open And then we work briefly through each of the skills, each of the 5 senses, for them to kind of, engage each of those senses. And then invariably, I ask them what that was like, and they say, wow, that's really good. I feel much better. I feel much more calm, right? And then I just very quietly, and almost apologetically, I say, that's really great. That's really great. I just want you to know that it's not always going to work that way, because that's a really, really wonderful and pleasant side effect of what we're trying to do, right? And so, in that, I'm trying to let them have that experience, but also just kind of adjust slightly their expectations of what a present moment awareness is about, and in the ACT sense, it doesn't assume or presume that it will result in a particular emotional state, such as calmness or relief from anxiety. It's really more about being, as you say, viscerally and somatically present, aware, and engaged, rather than sort of, off here, while my body is here. So that's, exactly where I always start. That's totally, the foundation skill for everything.
Well, I know we have more questions here, but I also know that we're already a few minutes over time. I'm wondering if I can relay those questions and we can send out answers with the slide deck, etc.
Yes.
Does that work for you? And it's been great. Thank you so much for staying late and answering some of these questions. I know they're complex. And, appreciate everyone's time tonight. And if you're interested in exploring it further, we will have some tools for, there is a question about ways to ask about values. And in our session next week, we will have some tools that will be recorded and posted on the discussion board. So you're able to access those things. And we'll certainly look forward to some of these answers. And this is just a slide of our next presentation. So really appreciate your time tonight, Dr. Lam. Thank you, Christine. It's been great having everyone's participation and opinions, and hopefully we'll see you guys next week. Thank you so much.